The 54th Massachusetts Regiment was the second African American Union regiment organized for the Civil War. The members of the 54th would go on to be remembered for their bravery and fierce fighting against Confederate units. Lincoln argued that the Civil War was not fought to end slavery, but to prevent the disintegration of the United States, while abolitionists argued that the war was to end slavery and believed that African Americans should be allowed to fight for their freedom. Like I said in the first Kansas video, up until that point, African Americans weren't allowed to officially fight until January 1st, 1863. A month later, on February 1863, Governor John A. Andrew of Massachusetts would make the first call for African American soldiers, despite the fact that Massachusetts did not have many African American residents. 2 weeks later, the 54th Infantry Regiment would head off to training camp with more than 1,000 men, many of which came from New York, Indiana, Ohio, and a few even came down from Canada. 1/4 of the volunteers came from slave states in the Caribbean. Fathers and sons, some of which were at least 16 years old, enlisted together, and the most famous among them were Charles and Lewis Douglas, whose father is the abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Governor Andrew would choose a 25-year-old officer named Robert Gould Shaw, whose family were prominent abolitionists. Shaw had dropped out of Harvard to fight in the war and had been injured at the Battle of Antietam. At 9 o'clock in the morning on May 28, 1863, the men of the 54th Massachusetts would gather at the Boston Common and prepare to head to the battlefields in the South. 37 white officers along with 1,007 African American soldiers would leave despite the fact that the Confederate Congress had announced that any African American captured would be sold into slavery and any white man that commanded them would be executed. Well-wishers including the anti-slavery advocates William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Frederick Douglass lined the Boston streets to see the men off. I know not where in all human history to any given 1,000 men in arms there has been committed a work at once so proud, so precious, so full of hope and glory as the work committed to you, Governor Andrew said at the close of the parade. That evening the 54th would be on a boat bound for Charleston. Shaw and his troops would land at Hilton Head on June 3rd, and a week later they would be forced to participate in a destructive raid on the town of Darien, Georgia by Shaw's superiors. Shaw would become enraged, saying that his men had come to fight for freedom and justice, not to attack towns with no defense and no military significance. He would write to General George Strong and ask if the 54th might lead the next Union charge on the battlefield. While they were fighting to end slavery in the southern states, they were also fighting the fact that while white soldiers were paid $13 a week, African American soldiers were only paid $10 a week. To put that into context, the white soldiers were getting paid about $318.21 a week if it was today, and the African Americans were only getting paid about $244.78 a week, which is a difference of $73.43, which is makes it a lot bigger of a gap than a $3 difference. So just to put that in context of how much difference that is if it was today. To protest the inequality, the soldiers all refused to accept their pay until the African American soldiers were paid the same amount as the white ones. The pay would not be upped until the war was almost over, though. On July 18, 1864, the 54th Massachusetts prepared to storm Fort Wagner, which guarded the port of Charleston. At dusk, Shaw gathered 600 of his men on a narrow strip of sand just outside of the fortified walls and readied them for action. "I want you to prove yourselves. The eye of thousands will look on what you do tonight." As night fell, Shaw would lead his men over the wall. I'm not sure how many men they expected to be there, but 1,700 greeted Shaw and his men, and 280 of the 600 men were either killed, captured, or gunned down. Shaw himself would be killed by a bullet to the chest as he was climbing over the wall. To show their contempt, Confederate soldiers gathered up the bodies and dumped all of them into one mass grave before sending a cable to the Union leader stating, "In an attempt to keep any white men from wanting to serve with African Americans," but it actually did the opposite. When Shaw's parents found out what had happened to their son, they replied with, "We would not have his body removed from where it lies, surrounded by his brave and devoted soldiers, if we could accomplish it by a word." Eventually, the bodies of Shaw and his men would be removed and reinterred into Beaufort National Cemetery in Beaufort, South Carolina. While the 54th did not win the Battle of Fort Wagner, the Confederates would have to eventually abandon it, and the remaining members of the 54th would go on to participate in several more battles over the next 2 years, before returning to Boston in September of 1865. 34 years after the 54th originally left Boston to serve in the war, sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens would unveil the statue he had created in their memory on Memorial Day of 1897. It sits in the same spot that the regiment began its march in Boston Common, and it depicts Shaw and his men as they march heroically off to war. Above them is an angel carrying an olive branch and a bouquet of poppies.